He never spoke. Not once. Not in class, not to friends, not even when they mocked him. And when the teacher called his name to read aloud, everyone laughed. Phones came out. Memes were already in the making. But then, he stood. And what happened next didn't just silence the room, it shattered it. This isn't just a story about a boy reading a book. It's about the moment silence becomes power. About a voice that had waited years to be heard. Stay until the end, because when he speaks the final line, you'll feel it and you won't leave without commenting. I promise. The school bell rang. Not sharp, but hollow, like a distant knock on a forgotten door. Outside, the sky hung heavy with low gray clouds, casting a muted blue sheen across the cracked sidewalks of Preston Ridge High. It was Friday, but the wind whispered more like a Monday, dragging leaves across the courtyard in lazy spirals. Students spilled into the corridors like a wave that didn't care what it washed over. Loud, alive, oblivious. In the midst of it all, one boy moved differently. His name was Elijah. You wouldn't have noticed him if you weren't looking closely, and even then he had a way of slipping past your gaze like fog through chain link. Thin-framed, sharp-shouldered, he walked with his eyes just low enough to avoid conversation, just high enough to avoid the floor. His shoes were worn smooth at the heels, laces knotted and fraying like roots trying to hold on to something underground. His breath came quiet, measured. His presence in the hallway was like a pause in a sentence no one remembered speaking. In room 3B, Elijah was more myth than boy. They called him the ghost in the desk by the window. He'd sat in the same seat since freshman year. Second, row third from the back, always by the window, always where the light barely reached. He hadn't said a single word in class, not once, not when Mr. Nolan asked questions, not when students were called on, not even when the fire alarm went off and everyone else had screamed, laughed, or cursed. Elijah had simply stood and walked out, silent as smoke. But silence has a weight. And at Preston Ridge, it drew attention. They said he was mute. Others whispered that he was just stuck up. One meme circulated on the school's private chat forum. A photoshopped picture of Elijah with his mouth zipped shut, above the caption, "Public speaking legend. 0 decibels of doom." Most laughed. Some didn't. Mr. Nolan, a man whose tie was always askew and whose patience was thinner than his coffee, once told the class, "There's genius in that boy's writing. Shame he hides it behind silence." But even Nolan had stopped trying. He now looked through Elijah the way one looks through a window you've given up trying to clean. At home, Elijah's world was different. His grandmother, Miss Dolores, once a nightclub jazz singer in Memphis, raised him in a small, echoing house filled with old records and softer shadows. Her voice was velvet cracked by time. She didn't ask Elijah to speak. She sang to him. "Your voice," she'd tell him, placing her hand over his chest, "isn't lost. It's just waiting for the right moment, like a trumpet in the dark." Every night she played the same song, Billie Holiday's "I'll Be Seeing You," and Elijah would sit in the doorway, mouthing the lyrics like a secret prayer. Could speak, he did speak, but only when the world didn't look at him. In the quiet of that small living room, his voice was a whisper across still water. Outside, though, at school in public, his throat locked like a door with too many bolts. He wasn't broken, he was just scared, and no one cared to knock gently. Not until the week they asked him, forced him to speak out loud. Not until the lie. World turned toward the boy who could not speak, and he finally turned back. The announcement came over the intercom on a Monday morning, with the kind of cheerfulness that doesn't ask for consent. This week is our annual Week of Voice, a celebration of confidence, clarity, and courage. Every student will be given the chance to read aloud a passage they love. Let's inspire each other with words that matter. Elijah sat at his desk, motionless. Around him, a dozen other reactions bloomed like fireworks. Groans, laughter, mock horror. Someone in the back muttered, "Kill me now." Another mimicked a TED Talk speaker, waving a pencil like a microphone. But no one looked at Elijah. Not yet. That came later. During lunch, someone took it too far. A group of juniors dragged over a lunch tray to Elijah's table in the far corner. There were 4 of them, loud, bored, the kind of boys whose personalities only lit up when someone else dimmed. One leaned in, voice slick with mock sincerity. "Hey, Elijah, want to practice your part with us? We're dying to hear your dramatic monologue." The others burst into laughter. Elijah didn't flinch. His tray held half a sandwich untouched. His eyes didn't rise, so they took it up a notch. The leader zipped his mouth closed, sat back theatrically, and stared forward. "Shh," he whispered to the others. "Let's rehearse his reading, it's a long one." They all sat in pantomimed silence for a minute, deadpan, cruel. One even held up a phone, fake live streaming the moment with a running commentary. Day 1 of listening to Elijah's performance. "I think I heard something. Oh wait, nope. That was just my soul dying." By the time they left, the cafeteria had joined the joke in spirit. A few students looked over with amused smirks. Others didn't know what was happening, but grinned anyway. It didn't take long before a meme appeared on the school's private Instagram. Elijah's face slightly blurred, overlaid with text. "When the quiet kid's turn to speak finally comes." Underneath, volume, still loading. It went viral, at least as viral as a high school post could. But the wound it left was deep and wordless. At home, Elijah didn't mention any of it. He never did. Instead, he helped his grandmother wash dishes, dried them carefully like he was handling Crystal, and afterward sat beside her on the floor as she sifted through old books in a cedar chest. She pulled one out, worn, foxed at the corners, its cover a faded blue. "The Little Prince," she said softly, handing it to him. "Your father gave this to me the day he found out you were coming. Said it was the only book that ever made." Him cry. Elijah opened the first page. The letters blurred slightly, his hands trembling just enough to give him away. "I want you to read it," she said. He looked up sharply, eyes wide with hesitation. "Not out loud. Not yet. Just to yourself. Let it talk to you. Let it whisper where no one else can." So he did. That night, under a blanket of Billie Holiday and kitchen light shadows, Elijah read the first 3 chapters, and something began to shift. Not dramatically, not enough to make him speak, but something beneath his ribs loosened. He read the line 3 times. "All grown-ups were once children, but only few of them remember it." He pressed the book to his chest like a heartbeat. Back at school, Mr. Nolan posted the reading schedule. 5 days, 5 names per day. Elijah was listed for Friday, the last slot before the final bell. "You don't have to read a novel," Nolan said to the class. "Just something that means something to you. A poem, a speech, a quote, even a paragraph." Elijah traced his name on the paper. Someone had scribbled next to it. "Can we skip Friday?" He erased it. As the week unfolded, the air in room 3B changed. Each day, students stood and read their chosen pieces. Some stumbled, others soared. Poems about heartbreak, a eulogy from someone's grandfather's funeral, a rap verse, a Bible quote. Most read too fast, some cried. Many laughed, and all the while Elijah sat still. The room grew more and more tense each day, like an orchestra tuning itself too tight. People began whispering again. "Is he really gonna do it? I heard he hasn't talked since, elementary school. I bet he'll fake sick." By Thursday, phones were already being prepped. A live stream was rumored. One girl posted, "Can't wait for Elijah's turn TMRW. It's either gonna be legendary or hilarious." Another commented, "Get your popcorn, the ghost's got a mic now." But no one, not even the cruel ones, truly expected what would happen next, because some silences are not empty. Some are gathering something fierce, waiting, brewing like a storm, that no one sees coming, and when it breaks, it does not ask permission. Friday arrived with the stillness of snowfall, even though there was no snow. The sun was high but pale. Its light filtered through the windows of room 3B like watered-down gold, catching the dust in mid-air as if time itself had stopped to watch. The room, which had been loud all week with laughter, nerves, and applause, now carried an unfamiliar weight, expectation, thick and humming. Elijah sat in his usual seat, back straight, hands folded on his desk like folded wings. He wore a navy sweater, no logos, no messages, just plain like his silence. But his eyes, they flicked once toward the front of the room, toward the wooden lectern that now stood like a gallows in the minds of some. Then back to his book, open on his lap. The Little Prince. He had chosen only a single page. The room's energy was restless. Phones were half hidden under desks, set to record. A few whispered bets were still being made in the back. He's gonna just stand there again. Nah, he'll crack this time. I heard he passed out once in 3rd grade when they asked him to read. True story. Mr. Nolan stood beside the whiteboard, arms folded across his chest. Not impatient, not expectant, but hoping in a way only teachers know. Quietly, protectively, powerlessly. At 2:43 p.m., Nolan cleared his throat. And last but not least, Elijah Moore. A subtle ripple ran through the room. Elijah stood up. It was not a dramatic motion. No music swelled. No gasps were heard. He simply stood, carefully, deliberately, like someone stepping onto ice they weren't sure would hold. He walked toward the front, book in hand. The only sound was the creak of the wooden floor beneath. His feet. When he reached the lectern, he didn't look up. Not yet. He placed the book gently, precisely. His fingers trembled slightly as he opened it to a bookmarked page. The room was so quiet you could hear someone swallow. A few students adjusted their phones, not even bothering to be discreet. And then, silence. 10 seconds passed. 15. The tension became unbearable. Someone coughed. Another whispered, "Called it." Mr. Nolan took a step forward but stopped. Then softly, almost like a breeze blowing across a microphone, Elijah spoke. All grown-ups were once children, but only few of them remember it. The voice wasn't loud. It wasn't polished. It wavered on the edges like a candle trying not to die. But it was there, and that was enough. Heads turned. One girl lowered her phone. Elijah's hands were still trembling, but his voice didn't crack. He continued. I have lived a great deal among grown-ups. I have seen them intimately, close at hand, and that hasn't much improved my opinion of them. His voice began to stretch itself, word by word, like a creature waking from long hibernation. It wasn't booming or theatrical, but it was true. The way truth is when someone isn't performing it, just giving it raw and real. Somewhere near the back, the boy who had once mocked him slouched lower in his seat. One girl slowly put her phone down on her desk, screen. Facing away, Elijah kept reading. The grown-ups are certainly very, very odd. They forget what really matters. They care about numbers, about owning things, about being right. His eyes stayed on the page, but something in the way he stood, his posture, the set of his jaw, began to change. The fear didn't leave. He carried it still. But now he carried it with dignity. And the room, that room full of voices that had always drowned him out, fell into the kind of hush that doesn't beg for noise. It listened, not out of politeness, but because it had no choice. He read the final line of his passage, quietly, firmly, like he meant to tuck it into every heart in the room. It is only with the heart that one can see rightly. What is essential is invisible to the eye. He closed the book, lifted his head and looked out, not away. For the first time, Elijah's eyes met theirs. Not accusing, not afraid, just present. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was sacred. Even Mr. Nolan didn't speak. He just stood there, one hand resting gently on the edge of his desk, his face unreadable except for the shimmer in his eyes. No one clapped, because clapping would have broken something fragile and beautiful still hanging in the air. What Elijah had given them wasn't performance. It wasn't victory. It was a confession. A quiet, trembling declaration, I am here, I have a voice, and you cannot take it from me. Somewhere near the window, the light had shifted. It now touched Elijah's sweater, warm and amber like it had waited 3 years to finally reach him, and maybe in some small unspoken way it had. By the time Elijah returned to his seat, the bell hadn't yet rung, but something in the room had already ended. The old rules, the cruel physics of silence and scorn, had dissolved. Something had broken open, not loudly, but irreversibly. A stillness remained, the kind that follows revelation or ruin. A few students looked down at their desks, as if caught listening to a private truth not meant for them. Elijah didn't look at anyone. He didn't have to. What he'd given them would echo without need of eye contact or applause. Mr. Nolan quietly walked to the front. His throat worked once, and for a moment it seemed he might speak. But instead, he nodded. Once. Then turned, and wrote a quote on the board. Without comment, without attribution. Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's the quiet voice at the end of the day whispering, "I will try again tomorrow." That night, the clip of Elijah reading, posted without his knowledge, spread through the school like a whisper carried on the wind. The phones that had once mocked him now became the very vessels that passed on his voice. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't viral in the internet sense. It was something rarer, respected. The comments under the post were a quiet storm of guilt, awe, and unexpected tenderness. I've been in that class for 2 years. I never heard him say one word. This broke me. He didn't just speak, he baptized us in truth. I was one of the ones who laughed. I'm not proud. I'll never forget this. Room 3B doesn't deserve him. Elijah Moore, the loudest silence we've ever heard. The caption originally posted, "Friday's clown show," was quietly deleted. In its place, a new post appeared, a still of Elijah at the lectern, eyes lowered, lips mid-sentence. Beneath it, only these words: "The voice you laughed at, the soul you didn't see." On Monday, Mr. Nolan printed Elijah's passage and pinned it on the bulletin board, bordered in soft gold paper. Above it, a hand-lettered sign, "The day silence spoke." There were no grades given that week for the reading project. Mr. Nolan said it didn't seem right. Not after that. The students who had mocked Elijah most harshly never apologized out loud. But silence took on a different weight now. Someone left a folded note in his locker. No name. Just one sentence. "I'm sorry I didn't see you before you spoke." Another left a chocolate bar on his desk. No words. Just a gesture. Clumsy but real. And in the days that followed, something else changed. When Elijah walked the halls, students moved. Not away, but aside, with space and recognition. Not pity, not celebrity. Something softer. Respect. In one class, the boy who'd led the cafeteria mockery raised his hand to read. He stumbled through a poem, cracked halfway, sat down red-faced. Elijah didn't smirk. He didn't even flinch. He simply watched. And when the boy passed him on the way out, their eyes met. Just briefly. Something passed between them, not friendship, but a truce. A week later, the school hosted its spring assembly. Principal Myers, stiff and smiling, announced that one student would give a reading to close the ceremony. Something to inspire us as we grow. To no one's surprise, Elijah was chosen. To everyone's surprise, he said yes. This time, he didn't read from The Little Prince. He chose a short poem his father had once written, a piece found folded into the back of a photo album, untouched. For over a decade, the poem wasn't remarkable by literary standards. But in Elijah's voice, every line landed like truth sung in a quiet cathedral. A name is not a label. It's a door waiting to open, and a voice is not a weapon, but a home waiting to be spoken. When he finished, there was silence again, and then, only then, did the applause come. It didn't burst. It rose like warmth. Like morning, Elijah didn't bow. He didn't smile. He just nodded once and stepped away from the mic. But in that small gesture was a universe of power reclaimed. Spring leaned slowly into summer, and the world around Preston Ridge High began to soften. The air warmed. Trees blushed green again. The bell that once sounded like a summons now rang more like a goodbye waiting its turn. Final papers were turned in. Locker doors swung shut with a tired clatter. The students shed their walls just a little, just enough to remember they were human. Elijah still walked the halls with quiet steps, but now the silence around him was different. It wasn't absence. It was reverence. No one called him names. No one mocked his quiet. Some still didn't know how to speak to him. That was okay. Not everyone needs to speak to understand. A few weeks later, during a lunchtime meeting of the school's struggling theater club, a voice, tentative and young, asked a question. Do we need someone to help with reading lines, like if someone's scared? The teacher looked up. You mean a coach? Yeah, the student said. Like someone who could, help us not freak out. Another voice chimed in, almost shyly. Elijah could do that, right? All eyes turned to where Elijah sat, half in shadow at the back of the room. He'd only come in because the door had been open. He wasn't a club member. He wasn't anything officially. But he looked up and nodded, and so quietly, without anyone posting about it or making it a thing, Elijah became what no one had expected. A guide. He never asked for the role. He never raised his voice. But when someone in the club looked terrified before reading a monologue, Elijah would sit next to them in the wings. He'd hand them a folded note with a quote. Sometimes it was a line from The Little Prince. Sometimes it was just say it true. He never said more than needed, but somehow it was always enough. At home, his grandmother had begun to need more help, walking slower, dozing longer in her chair. But her pride in him was a flame so steady, it lit the whole house. One evening, after dinner, she handed Elijah a small box. Inside was an old microphone, dented, heavy, silver-tipped. She ran a finger along its curve and said, Your father gave me this the night I sang my first solo. I want you to have it. Elijah touched it as if it might break. His fingers curled around the handle. You may not be a singer, she said, but you've got a voice, and you've learned what to do with it. Elijah didn't speak. He didn't need to. His arms around her said enough. At the end-of-year ceremony, when awards were passed out like candy, most improved, best in sports, most likely to succeed, there was one that wasn't listed in the program. Mr. Nolan stepped up with an envelope. This isn't a typical award, he began, glancing toward the second row where Elijah sat, hands folded. This is for a student who reminded us that bravery doesn't always look like noise or confidence or bold speeches. Sometimes bravery is a whisper that refuses to die. He opened the envelope. Elijah Moore, Voice of the Year. A pause, then a standing ovation. Elijah walked to the stage, slowly, with no hurry to prove anything. Mr. Nolan shook his hand. No cameras flashed, no dramatic music played, just applause. Steady, sure, human. On the final day of school, Elijah sat backstage once again, this time with another student beside him, eyes wide with panic before her reading. I can't do it, she whispered. Elijah passed her a small card folded twice. She opened it inside in tidy handwriting. You're not alone. You never were. She turned to look at him. He nodded just once, and then she rose, stepped out into the light, and began to read. Elijah remained where he was, in the hush behind the curtain. He didn't need the spotlight. He had already stepped into something bigger, himself. And sometimes that's the greatest sound of all. If this story touched your heart even for a moment, share it. There's someone out there who needs to hear that silence can be strength, that voices bloom in their own time. And if you'd like more stories that whisper, then roar. Stories that heal. Remember to subscribe to the channel. You never know which voice will be the one to stay with you.